According to modern astronomy, our universe is extremely vast, but almost empty. The different stars and planets are separated by such extreme distances that it is practically impossible for one to go from one to the other. There is even doubt if life exists in other planets, or if it's just an anomaly that just appeared once in our blue planet. However, the Vedas give a very interesting description of the universe that is in many aspects much more far out than the wildest science fiction. A universe with multiple dimensions, cosmic passage, and mystical features, based not in matter and physical laws, but on different levels of consciousness. To study the model of the universe given the Vedas is the key for not only understanding better the complexities and subtleties of our universe, but also to expand and elevate our consciousness. The first point to understand is that the view of the cosmos given by modern science is based on sense perception, or what we can observe using our vision, hearing, etc. It doesn't matter if one tries to observe the universe using his naked eye or a telescope, he will be limited by his senses and intelligence. In the Jyotish Shastras, the Vedas also give a view of the universe very similar to modern science. In the Surya Siddhanta, for example, it is described that the circumference of the earth is 8,000 miles, very close to modern estimate that is 7,928 miles. The distance to Mars is estimated in 1.54 AU, astronomical units, again very close to modern estimate that is 1.52 AU. The average distance to the Moon is giving us 415,210 kilometers, close to the modern 384 kilometers, and so on. The Surya Siddhanta even hints on the orbit of Uranus, what was discovered only in 1781. Therefore, the view of the universe described by modern science was not unknown to the sages of previous ages. The question is that the Vedas offer something more. In the Puranas, the universe is described in a radically different way. Instead of solar systems and galaxies, our universe is organized in several levels of planetary systems, which resemble disks, one on top of the other. In the middle, we have Earth and other intermediate planetary systems. In the lower half, we have the lower planetary systems, where the Asuras live, while in the upper half, we have the planetary systems where the Devas, as well as very elevated sages live. In this description, each planetary system resembles a disk, and these different disks are stacked on top of the other, separated by a certain distance. This view of the universe is radically different from what we learn in school, and also different from what we can observe when we look to the sky. How to understand it? The question is that modern astronomy, as well as the Surya Siddhanta, describe the universe according to the sense perception of human beings, what we can perceive using our senses. The Puranas, on the other hand, describe the universe from the point of view of superior beings, who have different sets of senses and thus perceive reality in a completely different way than we do. Most of the books in the Vedas were received by humanity from higher beings. Most of them were spoken by divine beings or by inhabitants of the higher planets, while others were spoken by perfect beings from the spiritual realm. The Surya Siddhanta, however, was received from Maya Danava, an architect from the lower planetary systems. Being interested in matter and not in spirituality, he gave humanity knowledge of the gross dimension, the same we can also perceive. In the Surya Siddhanta, very ingenious calculations are given. These calculations allows one to calculate the position of a planet in any given time. Nowadays, the calculation of orbits of planets is done by complex softwares that takes a lot of processing power to run, while the calculations in the Surya Siddhanta were developed to be simple enough to be solvable by hand. This knowledge was used by sages in older times to calculate the position of different planets, eclipses, etc. Calculations necessary for performing astrological calculations, which were taken very seriously by people of antiquity. This knowledge has thus a practical application. The description offered by the Puranas, on the other hand, was given to humanity by higher beings, and thus described their view of the cosmos. These beings live in a subtle dimension and have a much higher level of consciousness and different sets of senses. It may sound strange that different beings could have such different conceptions of reality, but this is actually something that can be observed even in our own planet. Carnivorous animals like tigers see in black and white, while we see in colors. Butterflies can see ultraviolet light that is invisible to us, while certain animals can't see at all, being guided only by smell. In fact, our concept of reality is based on electrical signals our brain receives from our eyes, nose, ears, etc. If one would receive a different set of senses, he would perceive reality in a different way. In other words, we can only understand the world to the extent our senses allow it. The same way a person that is completely blind will never be able to understand what color is, the limitation of our senses prevent us from seeing and understanding many things that are experienced by higher beings. Apart from physical differences, there is also a difference in consciousness. The concept of reality of an ant is rudimentary if compared to a human being, for example. Similarly, our concept of reality is very limited if compared to the view of more evolved beings. For us, the numerous planets and stars that compose the universe are arranged in a more or less random fashion in several galaxies. For the Devas, however, planets and stars are grouped according to the level of consciousness of their inhabitants. Therefore, planets inhabited by beings of higher consciousness are grouped together, and similarly, planets of beings of lower consciousness are grouped together. However, the planets of the higher beings are very far from the planets of lower beings. This leads to an hierarchical perception of the universe that is described in the Puranas. We can better understand how the universe can be perceived so differently by different beings with a simple example. In the same room, we can have different frequencies of radio signals, like AM, FM, TV, 3G, 4G, Wi-Fi, etc., each one carrying a particular set of information. Although all the signals are simultaneously available, the one can tune in depends on the device he is using. One that is using an old radio will be able to capture only sound, while others with a television will be able to also see images. One with a phone, on the other hand, will have access to the internet, which includes much more content, including the radio and TV programs. In the TV, programs are organized in a linear way, and therefore two chapters of the same series may be very distant from each other. One may have to wait for a whole week, while on the internet the same programs are organized by topic, and one can go from one episode to the next effortlessly. On the TV, an episode of the series may be closer to a news program that is exhibited immediately after it, while the next episode might be very far, being exhibited only the next week. But in the internet, things are organized in a semantic way, and therefore one that is using the internet see them close to each other in the same site or playlist, while the news program may be distant in a completely different address. Similarly, our universe is composed of different dimensions, and space is organized in different ways according to the dimension one is living. Not only reality is much more complex than we can perceive with our senses, but different beings have different sets of senses and can perceive the universe in different ways. Just like the conception of reality of a human is much more evolved than the concept of reality of an ant, superior beings perceive the universe in a very different way than we do. For the Devas, everything is much closer, and they can travel from one planet to the other the same way we can go to the supermarket. One can synchronize these different dimensions according to the particular set of senses he got, which is in turn determined by his previous consciousness. According to the Vedas, our concept of reality is determined according to our consciousness. Because of our consciousness, we assume a particular type of body in a certain planet and have access to a certain level of reality. In our case, we live in a gross dimension, where the universe appears cold and almost vacant, with the stars and planets very distant from each other and are practically inaccessible for us. We are essentially imprisoned in our little planet by the law of gravity. Even if we send some probes or astronauts at an exorbitant cost to investigate what is beyond, they can't find anything very interesting outside. One key factor to understand how superior beings have such a different concept of space than we do is the existence of interplanetary pathways. It's described, for example, that certain passages in the Himalayas connect our planet to the celestial planets, but only persons with a certain level of consciousness can access such passages. In the Mahabharata, it is described how the Pandavas ascended to the place of Kuvera, the king of the Yakshas, through one of these pathways. For one who is able to cross these pathways, the other parts of Jambudvipa are just a walk away, and therefore the Srimad Bhagavatam describes these different interconnected fragments as a continuous area, which is exactly the perception of one who is traveling through them, although in our sense perception, these different parts of the structure are spread through different planets. This explains the huge dimensions of the geographical details of Jambudvipa described in Srimad Bhagavatam. The mountains described there are not found on our planet, at least not in our gross dimension, but qualified people can access these geographical locations situated in other parts of the cosmos through these subtle passages. For one who doesn't have the proper qualification, however, the pathways are invisible and he will be stuck in this planet. As a result, when he crosses the Himalayas, he goes to China instead of the celestial planets. One way to understand how this can be possible is by a simple example. Imagine two tall buildings built beside each other. Normally, to go from an apartment on the top of the first building to another on the top of the second, one would have to go all the way down and then all the way up, which could be a long way. If he had access to a walkway between the two buildings, he could go from one apartment to the other very easily. For him, the distance between the two apartments would be very short, while for other people who had to take the long way, it would still be very far. Similarly, a person who could use the pathway would have the perception that the two apartments form a continuous area instead of being part of two separate buildings. Similarly, the fact that the Devas can travel easily through the universe makes their concept of space very different from ours. The existence of connected objects that are far apart, as well as shortcuts that allow one to access places that are far away, may seem fantastical, but these ideas are also discussed in modern physics, with the phenomenon of quantum entanglement and the theory of the wormholes, for example. Another concept given in the Puranas is the idea of a subtle vertical dimension. More than just a change in geographical location, to access higher planets, one has to also change his consciousness, which can be done only by practicing a spiritual process of self-realization. Not only other planets are very far from Earth, but even if one goes there, one will find only rocks, dust, poisonous gases, and extremes of temperature, without the possibility of interacting with the local inhabitants, which will be living in a different dimension. For example, according to our three-dimensional view of reality, the Moon is situated at about 384,000 kilometers from Earth, and one can reach it in about 3 days in a space probe. Unfortunately, if one goes there, he will find only dust and rocks. The Puranas, however, state that the Moon is actually a celestial planet, with a standard of living superior to our planet. To access it, however, one has to develop a very subtle consciousness, similar to the superior beings who live there. Without this change in consciousness, one may go to the Moon, but he will see only rocks. This can be explained with another example. Suppose you want to visit an office in the 98th floor of a prestigious building in Manhattan. You take a taxi and go to the front of the building. You went to the right place on the horizontal dimension, but to reach the office, you also need to travel in the vertical dimension, taking a lift or the stairs, going up until you reach the 98th floor. If somehow your credentials don't allow you to enter the building, you will be stuck in the street. Similarly, when a human being goes to the moon without the proper consciousness, he will not be able to travel in the subtle vertical dimension, and will thus be stuck in the gross dimension, where there is only dust and rocks. Our universe is composed of different dimensions, and we can synchronize in each one according to the particular sets of senses we got, which is in turn determined by our previous consciousness. The Puranas state that the celestial moon is actually pretty far from the Earth in the subtle vertical dimension, even further away than the Sun or other planets of our solar system. To reach there, one has to radically change his level of consciousness. Therefore, the process to access the celestial moon involves not only changing one's consciousness and thus traveling in the subtle vertical dimension, but also acquiring a particular set of senses. In the past, this was an art understood by yogis who were able to travel through the universe by elevating their consciousness and thus transferring themselves to the desired planet. One of the most notable features of the universe described in the Vedas is Bhumandala, that comprises the intermediary planetary system. Bhumandala is situated in the middle of the universe and essentially divides it in half, being the lower and dark part reserved to the Asuras and the upper luminous part to the Devas. Human beings live close to the surface of this structure on the luminous side. Our planet is situated close to the center of the gigantic structure in a landmass called Jambudvipa that is surrounded by the other islands and oceans. In the middle there is a mountain chain which culminates in Sumeru mountain, that is where the Devas live. The Srimad Bhagavatam gives a detailed explanation of the different beings who live in different parts of this structure. This is the part of the Vedic universe that is most difficult to understand, especially because it brings to the mind the idea of a flat earth, which is obviously not the case. The Srimad Bhagavatam, for example, states that people living in countries at points diametrically opposite to where the sun is first seen rising will see the sun setting. And if a straight line were drawn from a point where the sun is at midday, the people in countries at the opposite ends of the line would be experiencing midnight. Similarly, if people residing where the sun is setting were to go to countries diametrically opposite, they will not see the sun in the same condition. This verse describes the basic notion that the earth is a globe and the motions of the sun, resulting in the passage of days and nights as we can observe. When it's midday in Japan, it will be midnight in Brazil, for example. The same Srimad Bhagavatam also describes the movements of the sun that results in the passage of seasons. The only difference is that it explains it from a geocentric perspective, while modern astronomy uses an heliocentric model. However, for practical purposes, both work for describing the movements of the sun and the different stars and planets. As stated, let it be understood at the onset that it makes no difference from the point of view of describing planetary motion whether we take the Earth or the Sun as the center of the solar system, since the issue is one of relative motion only. I can construct for you a spherically symmetrical universe with Earth at the center, and you cannot disprove it based on observations. You can only exclude it on philosophical grounds. In my view, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. We know now that the difference between a heliocentric and a geocentric theory is one of motions only, and that such a difference has no physical significance. Apart from that, the Srimad Bhagavatam describes that in the higher dimensional universe of the Devas, other intermediary planetary systems are on the same plane as our planet, and can be accessed by sufficiently evolved beings through interplanetary passages. It's described, for example, that Parikshit Maharaj, the grandson of the Pandavas, was able to visit other parts of Jambudvipa and receive tribute from the different kings living there. For us, however, the other parts of Jambudvipa are inaccessible, since we don't have the required level of consciousness, and thus we are isolated in our little planet. Richard L. Thompson, Sadaputra Prabhu, explains that the description of Jambudvipa offered in the Srimad Bhagavatam actually includes 4 different explanations. According to one's previous knowledge and area of interest, one could get one of these 4 understandings from the same explanation. This is possible due to the nature of Sanskrit language, where the same words can have more than a meaning, and thus an expert poet is capable of composing sentences that have multiple simultaneous meanings. One elementary example of this clever usage of the Sanskrit language is given in the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where Duryodhana, not wanting to displease neither Bhishma or Drona, his 2 senior generals, used a clever construction to praise both at the same time, using the sentence Aparyaptam tad asmakam palam Bhishma virakshitam. The sentence simultaneously means our strength is immeasurable because we are protected by Bhishma, and our strength is insufficient because we are protected by Bhishma. When Bhishma heard this sentence, he took the first meaning and was therefore encouraged. Dronacharya, on the other hand, took the second meaning, understanding that Duryodhana was glorifying him by minimizing the capacity of his rival. Such clever usage of words is common in Sanskrit literature, however, in the Srimad Bhagavatam it goes to a completely new level of complexity. According to Sadaputra Prabhu, the first explanation is Bhumandala as a stereographic projection or a planisphere of our planet, taking the North Pole as the center. This is commonly used to represent the feature of a sphere on a map. His research indicates that these maps were used for astronomical purposes, helping one to understand the movements of the Sun, planets, and important stars. Such planispheres were also used in instruments such as the astrolabe. The second is Bhumandala as a topographic map of South Central Asia, offering a basic description of the geography of our planet, with focus in the area of the Himalayas, India, and adjacent countries, with descriptions of the different rivers that flowed there in antiquity. The third explanation is as a map of the solar system. In this explanation, the borders of the different islands describe the orbits of the planets of our solar systems from the geocentric point of view adopted on the Puranas. Finally, the fourth explanation is as a map of the intermediary planetary system, as observed and experienced by the Devas, as explained previously. In this way, in just a single explanation, Srimad Bhagavatam offers astronomical, geographical, and mystical knowledge. Naturally, the geographical and astronomical part is covered by modern geography and astronomy, but the mystical knowledge about the subtle structures of the universe is exclusive to the Puranas. One difficulty with the description of the universe given in the Puranas is that it can be easily misunderstood as a description of a flat earth. In fact, such misunderstanding is very common, since the subtle aspects of the Vedic universe are rather difficult to comprehend. The hierarchical description of the universe given in the Puranas matches the sense perception of higher beings. They can easily go from one planet to the other, and for them everything is accessible and connected. One who doesn't understand all these sophisticated concepts can easily get the impression that the Puranas describe a flat earth. The Vedas also explain that before the beginning of Kali Yuga, or present age, different peoples of antiquity were part of a global Vedic culture and thus had access to the same knowledge. This explains how different groups had similar views of the universe, from the Chinese to the American Indians, including practically everyone in between. However, with the passage of time, the most advanced concepts were forgotten, and those different civilizations became stuck with a flat earth concept. This concept ended being described also in the Bible and in the Quran, leading to the modern flat earth theories. Flat earthers are thus actually not totally wrong. The problem is that they base their beliefs in impoverished, incomplete descriptions of the Vedic cosmos, failing to understand its higher aspects. The modern view of the cosmos is purely based on our sense perception, which leads to a mechanistic view of the universe that discards all the subtle and spiritual aspects. Many people instinctively disagree with this materialistic explanation and start looking for a more holistic view of the cosmos that accounts for the subtle dimensions they can understand and sometimes even perceive. It's not a wonder, thus, that there is a growing interest in Vedic cosmology. The Vedas offer a much more complete view of the universe, which accounts for both gross and subtle aspects and allows for the expansion of our consciousness. By meditating the subtle aspects of the universe described in the Vedas, one can gradually elevate his consciousness and attain the same level of awareness as higher beings. Conversely, the materialistic view of the universe offered by modern science offers one a dead universe that leads only to the stagnation of one's consciousness. The fact that our planet is a globe also illustrates another concept given in the Vedas. We think we are imprisoned on this planet because of the law of gravity, but actually we are prisoners of our own consciousness. One who tries to access higher realms by mechanical means will not be able to go anywhere, just like a person who tries to escape our planet by walking will just come back to the same place after circumambulating the globe. He may go to Mars or Venus, but without changing his consciousness, he will remain stuck in this gross dimension and will not be able to find anything interesting there. Real freedom is thus connected with the expansion of one's own consciousness. Without a change in consciousness, one may go anywhere in the cosmos, but he will remain imprisoned. Apart from our immediate surroundings, Srimad Bhagavatam describes other planetary systems that comprise our universe. This hierarchical view of the universe illustrates the different levels of consciousness of their inhabitants. Races that have a consciousness too much focused on matter live under the ground, without access to the light of the sun. In the Vedic universe, their abodes are organized in the lower planetary systems, below our plane. Many of these are actually described as heavenly realms, where the inhabitants live in great material opulence and try to enjoy their senses to the fullest extent, while others are not so desirable. At the bottom are the hellish planets, where souls that committed serious crimes go to pay for their debts before they can take their next birth. To fall into these lower realms can lead to very difficult and painful experiences. Therefore, the Puranas alert to the existence of such places, so we may avoid the course of actions that leads there. What is more interesting, however, is the higher planetary systems, to where one can ascend to the degree he can purify and elevate his consciousness through the practice of a spiritual process. The closest planetary system to us is Bhuvarloka, where different subtle beings live, notably the Yakshas and Rakshasas. It is described that their realm starts in the upper atmosphere, very close to us, but despite this we can't see since they live in a subtle dimension. Due to this proximity, however, they can easily contact human beings, which leads to many mystical experiences narrated through history. They are a mixed bag including benevolent and malevolent entities. These beings from Bhuvarloka are, however, different from ghosts, disembodied human beings living in our plane, because they live on a plane where they have different sense objects and can thus enjoy life just as we do, different from ghosts that are subtle beings stuck in a gross plane, where they can't interact with people or objects. This plane of Bhuvarloka is described as a beautiful place with lakes and forests, controlled by Kuvera, who possesses great material opulence. Higher is the planetary system of Swargaloka, where the Devas live in great delight. Because they live on the top of the plane of Bhumandala, their days and nights are different. For them, the sun is continuously circling around, and they see more light during the period when it's summer for us, when the sun goes high in the vertical plane, and less light when it's winter for us, when the sun goes lower. They take these as days and nights. Therefore, a set of day and night for them equals to 1 year for us. They live for 10,000 of such years, therefore their lifespan is quite long. The main difference between the Devas and Asuras is that the first group have a subtle consciousness, focused on subtle material enjoyment, connected with music, dance and arts, while the second group have a gross consciousness, focused on material objects and gross enjoyment through tact and taste. One group is interested in the subtle aspects of matter, while the other is interested in the gross aspects. This difference is explained in the book Mystic Universe by H. Dalela. Higher still are the higher planetary systems of Maharloka, Janaloka, and Tapaloka, inhabited by pure souls who are very serious in the path of self-realization. These realms are described in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita. The souls in Maharloka live in great serenity, living in pristine environments and dedicating their time to chant mantras and offer oblations to the fire, while souls in Janaloka and Tapaloka practice meditation. There are other abodes described in Srimad Bhagavatam, including the abodes of the Saptarishi and Dhruvaloka, which is a spiritual planet appearing inside our universe, but for the sake of brevity I am not including them here. These different abodes can be observed from Earth as the numerous stars we see in the night sky. Above all, there is Brahmaloka, the abode of Brahma, the architect of this particular universe. Brahmaloka is a very subtle abode which is not observable from Earth. Hierarchically, it is situated in the very top. During the existence of the universe, many pious souls gradually elevate themselves through the different planetary systems up to this level, where they can continue living until the end of the universe. When the universe reaches its end, all these pious souls go alongside Brahma to the spiritual realm. One important point when we study the Vedic universe is the distances. All the measurements of the universe given in the Puranas is based on a unit called yojana. This is a measure of distance based on the distance a horse can run before getting tired. As different horses can run different distances before getting tired, the length of the yojana varies through different sources, sometimes at 8 miles, 5 miles, etc. Similarly, there is all reason to contemplate the possibility that the yojana may vary across the cosmos, reflecting the concept of distance of the inhabitants in different planetary systems. Therefore, although Bhumandala is only 500,000 yojanas from one extreme to the other, roughly the size of our solar system, the vertical dimension would be extraordinarily bigger, since the size of the yojana would become exponentially bigger as one advances to higher planetary systems. If one accepts this idea, the universe starts to look more like a cone, where the narrow side represents the lower levels of consciousness of human beings and asuras, and the large side represents the higher states of consciousness of more elevated beings. In this model, Bhumandala is on the narrow side of the universe, and thus its dimensions are relatively modest on a cosmic scale, while higher planetary systems are on the wide side, which is practically infinitely big. This view is capable of harmonizing the descriptions of the Puranas with the huge cosmic distance that can be observed in modern astronomy. The main point is that although we are limited by such distances, higher beings are not. The great contribution of the model of the universe given in the Puranas is that it gives a mystical and theistic view of the universe, a universe that is teeming with life. By meditating these descriptions, one can gradually elevate his consciousness and attain the same level of awareness as higher beings. This is the view of the universe that is going to be presented in the Temple of Vedic Planetarium, the TOVP, when it's inaugurated in 2022. Conversely, the materialistic view of the universe offered by modern science, based solely on observation using our gross senses, offers one a dead universe that leads only to the stagnation of one's consciousness. The great challenge when we study the model of the universe given in the Srimad Bhagavatam is to reconcile what we can observe with our gross sense perception and the ideas of multi-dimensions, different sets of senses and degrees of consciousness, and the idea of a subtle vertical dimension. Without understanding these concepts, one may end up with some simplistic or limited understanding.